On February 20th, 1959, nearly 25,000 Canadians lost their jobs in a single afternoon. Not because of a recession, not because the product failed, because one man in Ottawa ordered the destruction of more of the most advanced fighter jet on Earth. Within weeks, over $1 billion worth of aircraft were blowtorched into scrap, and 32 of Canada's brightest engineers walked across the border straight into NASA. The Avro Arrow worked, so the real question was never what went wrong with the jet. It is who decided to destroy it, and why. At the edge of Toronto, the Avro Canada plant at Malton stretched across more than 1 million square feet, a city within a city, humming day and night. By 1958, it was the largest aerospace facility in the country, employing over 14,000 people on site and supporting another 15,000 through a dense network of suppliers. The workforce was a cross-section of Canadian ambition: engineers, draftsmen, machinists, toolmakers, and test pilots, many drawn from every province and a dozen countries. Inside the plant, the rhythm of production was relentless. Sheet metal workers shaped titanium and aluminum into delta wings. Apprentices, trained through Avro's own technical school and the Ontario Apprenticeship and Training Board, learned to forge turbine blades and assemble complex hydraulic systems. 5-year programs turned teenagers into craftspeople trusted with the Arrow's most demanding tolerances. Beyond Malton's gates, hundreds of companies supplied everything from avionics to landing gear. Canadian Car and Foundry delivered airframe components. General Motors Diesel provided power plant accessories, and de Havilland Canada contributed training aircraft elements. Every component, from the Orenda Iroquois engines to the smallest actuator, was either made at Malton or sourced from a Canadian supplier. The result was a seamless industrial chain: design, prototyping, testing, and assembly all under Canadian control. For the first time, Canada possessed the ability to conceive, build, and mass-produce a supersonic interceptor from scratch. The Arrow's supply chain was more than a list of contracts. It was a living system. Weekly shipments of high-temperature alloys arrived from Manitoba. Precision electronics came from Toronto. Small-town machine shops in Ontario and Quebec found themselves producing critical parts for a jet that would soon be the pride of the Royal Canadian Air Force. This ecosystem, built up over years and codified in blueprint libraries and engineering notebooks, represented a generational leap in national capability. At its peak, the Malton complex was not just a factory, but the heart of Canadian aerospace, pulsing with the hope that a country of 17 million could stand at the forefront of Cold War technology. In these walls, the stakes were measured not only in dollars or engineering feats, but in the livelihoods and futures of thousands of families tied together by a single, audacious project. On March 25, 1958, Janusz Żurawski climbed into the cockpit of Avro Arrow 201, the first prototype of Canada's audacious interceptor. Żurawski, a former Polish fighter ace, faced a machine that existed only in wind tunnel data and engineering blueprints until that moment. Wheels left the runway at Malton, and within minutes, the Arrow was airborne, stable, and fast. Żurawski's logbook that day recorded a clean climb to 40,000 feet and a level sweep from Mach 0.9 to Mach 1.5, with the Arrow breaking the sound barrier on its third flight. Debriefs praised the aircraft's handling at supersonic speeds and its remarkable stability, even as minor vibration issues hinted at the edge of what was possible with 1950s metallurgy. The Arrow's technical promise was more than marketing. Test flights over the next months saw the aircraft push to Mach 1.9, nearly 1,500 kilometers per hour, and a ceiling of 55,000 feet. Zhuravsky and his fellow pilots repeatedly demonstrated that the Arrow could climb to 45,000 feet in under 5 minutes. The aircraft's delta wing, tested in the National Aeronautical Establishment's wind tunnels, delivered the high-altitude maneuverability the Royal Canadian Air Force demanded for North American defense. Parallel to the airframe, Orenda's Iroquois engine was bench-tested to deliver 19,250 pounds of thrust with afterburner, promising Mach 2 performance once fully integrated. The Arrow's avionics suite, built around the AN/APG-24 radar, was designed for all-weather interception and guided missile engagement, technology at the forefront of the Cold War arms race. But the Arrow's technical triumphs came at a price. Each flight test, each new engine run, pushed the program's cost higher. By late 1958, the unit cost had crept toward $8 million per aircraft, making it one of the most expensive fighters on Earth. The program's total bill approached $1.1 billion, a figure that drew nervous attention in Ottawa. The Arrow had proven itself in the sky, but its future was about to be decided on the ground, where numbers on a balance sheet and shifting defense priorities would weigh as heavily as pilot skill or engineering excellence. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The news reached Ottawa within hours, and inside Canada's defense establishment, the implications were immediate. If the Soviets could send a satellite into orbit, they could soon send nuclear warheads across continents, not by bomber, but by missile. This was not just a technological feat. It was a strategic earthquake that forced Western military planners to question every assumption about air defense. Within weeks, the Joint Intelligence Committee convened in secret, compiling new threat assessments for the coming decade. Their January 1958 report, titled The Threat to North America from 1958 to 1967, landed on the desks of senior officials at National Defense Headquarters and the Royal Canadian Air Force. The report's conclusion was blunt. Soviet bombers would remain a threat for a few more years, but intercontinental ballistic missiles would soon eclipse them. The Arrow, designed to intercept manned bombers at high altitude, suddenly looked like yesterday's answer to tomorrow's problem. RCAF analysts pored over the numbers. The Arrow's performance was unmatched, but its role was shrinking as the bomber threat faded. Cabinet ministers, briefed by military and intelligence staff, faced a new calculus. The price tag for the Arrow was climbing, nearly $8 million per aircraft, with more than $1 billion already committed to the program. At the same time, American officials were urging Canada to join NORAD's missile defense umbrella and acquire Beaumark surface-to-air missiles, which promised to defend against both bombers and potentially missiles at a fraction of the Arrow's cost. Inside the Privy Council office, the debate was no longer just about engineering or national pride. It was about whether Canada could afford to spend billions on interceptors when the very foundation of air defense was shifting beneath their feet. The intelligence reports and fiscal projections set the stage for a political showdown, one that would pit advocates of sovereign technology against those convinced that the missile age had already arrived. George Perks, Canada's Minister of National Defense, stepped into the cabinet room with a stack of charts and a message that would reshape the country's military future. The Arrow's cost projections had climbed relentlessly, but Perks brought a new set of numbers: the price of switching to the American Beaumark missile system. On paper, the comparison was stark. For the cost of just 37 Arrows, Canada could acquire 56 Beaumark missiles, each with a reach that promised to shield the entire northern frontier. Perks argued that after Sputnik, the threat had changed. Missiles, not manned bombers, would define the next war. The Arrow, he said, was a masterpiece built for a vanishing enemy. Perks was not alone in pushing this view. Diplomatic cables from Washington pressed Canada to align its air defense with NORAD's missile plans. American officials promised integration, technical support, and, quietly, the political favor that came with buying U.S. hardware. Behind closed doors, the pressure was unrelenting. The Canadian Air Force's own studies, circulated among senior officers, began to echo the language of inevitability. The Arrow was too expensive, the future was missile-based, and time was running out. Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, facing a slowing economy and mounting budget deficits, saw the numbers as both a warning and an opportunity. Beaumark's advocates, led by Perks, framed the missile deal as a fiscal rescue, less than half the cost of continuing Arrow production, with the added benefit of keeping Canada in step with American defense doctrine. Internal memos reveal Diefenbaker's growing frustration. He doubted the wisdom of abandoning a homegrown jet, but the arithmetic left little room for sentiment. Cabinet discussions narrowed to a single question. Could Canada afford to defy the logic of numbers and the weight of Allied expectations? By February 1959, the divide between Perks and Diefenbaker was clear. Perks, the decorated general, insisted that the missile age had arrived and that Canada's security depended on swift adaptation. Diefenbaker, the prairie populist, hesitated, haunted by the prospect of mass layoffs and the loss of a national achievement. But the balance sheet and the relentless drumbeat from Washington left little doubt about which way the decision would fall. The cabinet, now fully briefed and under pressure to act, prepared for a day that would soon be known as Black Friday. At 9:20 a.m. on February 20th, 1959, the intercom crackled to life across the Malton plant floor. Crawford Gordon Jr., president of Avro Canada, delivered the words that would echo for decades. The Arrow program was finished. The government in Ottawa had pulled the plug. In the stunned silence that followed, Gordon's voice cut through. That goddamn son of a bitch in Ottawa. Within minutes, the shock rippled through every corridor and assembly bay. Supervisors, some fighting back tears, handed out pink slips by the stack. Toolmakers, engineers, apprentices, men and women who had staked their futures on Canada's most ambitious project were told to clear out their lockers. The news hit the Union Hall just as hard. Emergency meetings were called, but there was little left to bargain for. Union records from that day list 14,500 direct layoffs, with another 15,000 jobs vanishing across the supplier network. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 25,000 people, from machinists at Malton to electronics assemblers in small Ontario towns, suddenly found themselves out of work. The timing was ruthless. Parliament had barely opened its morning session when the press release hit the wires. By 10 a.m., the story dominated radio bulletins and front pages. On the plant floor, disbelief gave way to anger and confusion. Some workers gathered outside the main gates, demanding answers. Others drifted away in silence, carrying toolboxes and personal effects, their careers ended by a single political decision. The Arrow's technical achievements, supersonic flight, advanced radar, the promise of the Orenda Iroquois engine, counted for nothing against the cold math of budgets and new defense doctrine. For Gordon, whose own reputation had been tied to the Arrow's success, the sense of betrayal was personal and public. His outburst over the intercom captured the bitterness of a workforce blindsided by Ottawa's verdict. By noon, the Malton complex was emptying out. Skilled workers who had built the world's most advanced interceptor were now jobless, their futures uncertain. The ripple effect reached every corner of the Canadian aerospace industry. Contracts were cancelled, supplier firms shuttered, and the phone lines to Ottawa burned with calls from mayors, union leaders, and business owners demanding an explanation. But the decision was final. Black Friday had arrived, and with it, the irreversible end of the Arrow. Acetylene torches flared in the hangars at Malton as the orders came down. Every Arrow prototype, every engine, every piece of tooling was destroyed. The $1.1 billion program that had once promised to launch Canada to the forefront of aerospace was reduced, almost overnight, to scrap. In the days after Black Friday, security teams swept through the plant, collecting not just hardware, but knowledge itself. Blueprints, stress reports, test logs, thousands of documents were fed into shredders or burned in drums behind locked doors. The government's directive was clear: eliminate any chance the Arrow could be rebuilt by anyone, anywhere. Yet even as the erasure advanced, a quiet act of defiance unfolded. Ken Barnes, a senior draftsman whose hands had shaped the Arrow's lines on paper, moved with purpose through the chaos. According to accounts passed down through colleagues and family, Barnes managed to spirit away a set of original blueprints before the incinerators could claim them. He hid the drawings in his basement, preserving a fragment of what officials were determined to erase. The story, half confirmed and half legend, survives in whispers and a single redacted security file, proof only that someone noticed documents had gone missing, not what became of them. On the factory floor, the destruction was methodical. Workers who had built the Arrow now cut it apart, piece by piece. 5 flying prototypes, 14 airframe sections, and 2 Iroquois engines were reduced to tangled metal and molten pools. The blueprints that had filled Avro's vast drawing vaults vanished, leaving behind only rumors and a bitter sense of waste. One cockpit section, RL-206, was quietly saved, spirited out by a sympathetic museum curator before the torches arrived. Today, it sits in Ottawa, the sole survivor of a program meant to define a nation's future. The loss was not just physical. In the space of weeks, the knowledge base that had taken years to build was wiped clean. The erasure was so complete that even decades later, no complete set of Arrow plans has surfaced. What remains is a single cockpit, a handful of fragments, and the memory of a project erased by deliberate order. In the shadows of that destruction, Ken Barnes stands as a figure of mournful resilience, a quiet hero who tried, in the face of official oblivion, to keep the Arrow's legacy alive. Within weeks of Black Friday, the corridors at Malton were silent, but the world's hunger for Canadian engineering was just beginning. The shock of 14,500 layoffs rippled beyond the plant gates. As the Arrow's remains cooled in scrapyards, headhunters from the United States arrived in Toronto, briefcases in hand. They were not looking for blueprints. They wanted the minds that had drawn them. Among them was Jim Chamberlain, Avro's chief of technical design, a man whose signature appeared on nearly every critical Arrow drawing. Chamberlain, along with 31 other senior engineers, crossed the border to join NASA's newly formed Space Task Group. Their expertise, honed in the crucible of Arrow's design and test flights, became the backbone of America's Mercury and Gemini programs. The group included aerodynamicists, propulsion specialists, and avionics leads, engineers who, only months earlier, had been perfecting the Arrow's delta wing and integrating the Orenda Iroquois engine. The exodus was swift and decisive. NASA's personnel files from 1959 to 1962 list 32 former Avro engineers, most of them recruited directly from the Malton layoffs. They arrived in Houston and Langley with portfolios full of Arrow schematics, ready to tackle the technical puzzles of spaceflight. Chamberlain himself would go on to design the Gemini spacecraft and play a pivotal role in the Apollo lunar module. The American space program gained a cache of experience that had been built at Canadian expense for a jet that would never fly operationally. The loss was not just intellectual. The economic shock was immediate and lasting. With the Arrow cancelled, the Royal Canadian Air Force turned to the United States for its next interceptor. Between 1959 and 1965, Canada purchased 96 CF-101 Voodoo fighters, diverting more than $500 million in procurement spending to American firms. Contracts for avionics, engines, and maintenance that could have sustained the Malton supply chain instead crossed the border. The Arrow's promise of a sovereign, high-tech aerospace industry vanished almost overnight, replaced by dependency on imported hardware. For the engineers who stayed, the sense of betrayal lingered. The destruction of the Arrow was not just the end of a machine, but the scattering of a generation's ambition. Canada's aerospace future, once written in titanium and blueprints, now lived on in the flight paths of American rockets and the resumes of expatriate engineers. The day Crawford Gordon's voice echoed through the factory, cursing that goddamn son of a bitch in Ottawa, was not only the end of the Arrow, it was the start of Canada's brain drain, a wound that would take decades to heal. Canada's greatest jet vanished not from technical failure, but from a collision of shifting strategy, runaway costs, and one Prime Minister's final word. Crawford Gordon's furious declaration, "That goddamn son of a bitch in Ottawa," echoes in every shuttered hangar. Today, nations still debate how much innovation to sacrifice for security and how many futures to erase with a single order. Sometimes, the wreckage never leaves the runway.